Welcome to New Orleans, Kellen Moore. Now, what you gonna do about that quarterback situation? We got all that and a little bit of lanyard for you on today's episode of Locked On Saints.
You are Locked On Saints, your daily New Orleans Saints podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What is good, Who Dat Nation and Who Dat family? I am your host, your friend, Ross Jackson, New Orleans native, your New Orleans Saints expert and credentialed member of the media covering those New Orleans Saints as a Saints beat writer over at LouisianaSports.net and Saints analyst with WWL TV. And on today's episode of Locked On Saints, we're taking a look at the challenge ahead for New Orleans Saints new head coach Kellen Moore and the quarterback position. We'll dive into why there are no loyalties afforded in any of these decisions that are going to be upcoming for Kellen Moore. We'll take a look at why it would make sense to keep Derek Carr around, and we'll open with why it makes even more sense to move on. We've got all that coming up for you on today's episode. We appreciate you very much, whether it's your first time or your next time. We thank you for being here this time and making us your first listen and being an everydayer here on the show, which is a proud part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Shout out to Jim for the addition on that. Wasn't that great? So I think moving on from Kellen Moore. Can't move on from Kellen Moore just yet. The dude just got hired. All right, let's calm down, Ross. Moving on from Derek Carr makes the most sense for New Orleans Saints head coach Kellen Moore. I dove into this a little bit in yesterday's episode, but I wanted to kind of flesh this out a little bit more and really dive in and take a look at both sides of the equation here. And I'm going to start off with what I think the Saints should do, or what I think makes the most sense for New Orleans. Because this decision isn't really about Derek Carr. This decision isn't really about, is Derek Carr good enough to lead the Saints to a Super Bowl in 2025, to the playoffs in 2025, any of those things. This decision is really all about who Kellen Moore wants to invest his time with at the position. Now, you can get a free year one way or another if you're Kellen Moore. You keep Derek Carr, you say, that's not my guy, that was your guy, so moving on. But I do think that no matter what, Kellen Moore is going to get years of patience from this New Orleans Saints organization. He certainly deserves it, right? Coming into not the greatest roster situation, coming into the league's worst salary cap situation, coming into a pretty bad quarterback situation as well, i.e. there's no future starter on the roster. And just to remind you what my definition of a future starter is, a for sure future starter is a quarterback on a rookie contract with multiple years of starting experience. The Saints don't have that. Spencer Rattler could get there. He doesn't have that right now, but he is on a rookie contract and he's got a season with starting experience. Not necessarily a full season, but you know what I mean. I shouldn't say two full seasons of starting experience. But the reason why I think that it makes sense for the Saints to part ways with Derek Carr, and I'll be honest, I think it makes sense for Derek Carr as well, is that he is not long for New Orleans. He's not the Saints' future quarterback. He's the Saints' quarterback right now, and he could either spend a year in New Orleans guiding the team through what's going to be a tumultuous and in need of patience 2025 season so that they can effectively replace him in 2026, or he can go and play somewhere else where he could be looked at either as an option for multiple years. He could be looked at as a potential option for a playoff run, anything like that. Like that could be his next opportunity, and he could take that opportunity here in 2025. The popular dismount option, if you will, for Carr is to be traded from New Orleans, waiving his no trade clause, and joining the New York Jets under Aaron Glenn, a team that was in on him before he made the decision to come here to New Orleans instead. And then that sent the Jets to go and get Aaron Rodgers. And now Aaron Rodgers is out in New York, according to pretty much everyone, including the New York Jets themselves in many ways. And so they could go back, and they're not in position to draft a quarterback. They don't have a young quarterback that they can turn to. And the free agency class of quarterbacks is pretty bad, right? Sam Darnold's out there, but remember, That's a retread for Sam Darnold to go back to the New York Jets. I don't see that happening. The other notable quarterback that hits the market is Aaron Rodgers, and that's only because the New York Jets are moving on from Aaron Rodgers. And so Derek Carr becomes the most likely name, in any case at least, to potentially end up in New York as the Jets starting quarterback. It is a conversation that makes sense. There's also Justin Fields out there in free agency, but I don't think Justin Fields leaves Pittsburgh. Pittsburgh seems pretty intent on keeping him. If I'm Justin Fields, I have no reason to go anywhere but where I am, which is in Pittsburgh. And there's still a little bit of a likelihood, right, that Russell Wilson goes and teams back up with Pete Carroll over in Las Vegas with the Raiders. So that clears the path for Justin Fields to stay and be the starter in Pittsburgh next season. So with all of that considered, really the only other competition out there is Kirk Cousins, who looked abysmal by the end of the year. To Derek Carr's credit, if I offered you a quarterback that was going to play 27 games in 2 years, you'd probably say no. But if I offered you a quarterback that threw for 40 touchdowns, 13 interceptions, completed 68% of his passes, you might say yes. And that's a situation where the Jets might say yes. Like, they look at those numbers, they look at that production in 2 tumultuous years in New Orleans, and they could say yes to that. Now, if you also disclose that the record by the end of that was 14-13, maybe things change a little bit, but we'll just keep that on the hush. So I think it would give Derek Carr the opportunity to go somewhere that he's wanted, right? He chose New Orleans because he felt like New Orleans wanted him. He could go to New York because he can feel like New York wants him. And it gives Kellen Moore the best opportunity to get a look at guys that could end up being here for a while, right? You find success with Derek Carr in 2025. At best, he's with you in 2026, and then that's kind of the end of it. You find success with Spencer Rattler in 2025, he could still be your quarterback come 2035. And so for a guy like Kellen Moore, who's coming in for his first year, coming in and saying, okay, we're going to deal Derek Carr or cut him, designate him post June 1, save that money on June 2nd, whatever. You can still get under the salary cap, whichever works, right? If you can't trade him, or if he's not willing to wait his trade clause and everything like that. But if he wants to make sure he still gets his money, that's the way to do it, is to waive that no trade clause. And so if that happens, or if that doesn't happen, then you end up kind of in this stickier situation. But for Kellen Moore, he could say like, okay, well, I did a year with your young guy, right? Moved on from Derek Carr, and I did a year with your young guy. Now, that didn't work. Let me go and get my guy. Or look what I did with your young guy. Look how successful he is. We're rolling. And then that looks great for general manager Mickey Loomis as well, because this is probably Mickey Loomis's last hire. This is probably his last hire, like one way or another, right? Because either Kellen Moore is so successful that he sticks around long enough that Mickey Loomis's career kind of comes to a close while, he retires, rides off into the sunset, and Kellen Moore is still the head coach. Or Kellen Moore's tenure is a failure, and then the Saints have to change leadership to go and find their next head coach. And so being able to win with that head coach and that quarterback that the front office is very excited about in Spencer Rattler, that could go a long way for both Kellen Moore and Mickey Loomis as well as a part of that. So those are the ample reasons why I think that moving on from Derek Carr now instead of waiting until next year to do so is actually a wise move for New Orleans. Next, I want to discuss the competitive factor, which may signal that moving on from Derek Carr isn't the best choice. Let's get to that next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by our friends over at FanDuel. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on that than over at FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. And there's some big games tonight. You can check out a huge spread right now. The Orlando Magic 12.5-point favorites over the Charlotte Hornets. A great one to get in on, especially if you're a new customer over at FanDuel. You can bet on the money line, spread, you can do props, single game parlays, and so much more. But right now, over at FanDuel, customers can get $150 in bonus bets, new customers only, if you win your first $5 bet. That's all you got to do is visit FanDuel.com to join today, and that's FanDuel.com to get your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Put it on a heavy favorite $5 on a heavy favorite like the Orlando Magic, and bang, that's how you can walk away with that if they win. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, family. I think a lot of people would argue that from the competitive standpoint, keeping Derek Carr for 2025 is the right way to go. Here's what I mean by that. If the Saints are absolutely intent on the idea of going into 2025 with Kellen Moore at the helm, first-time head coach, fighting out of the salary cap situation, trying to rebuild this roster, and if they are absolutely intent on competing and saying, we're going to the playoffs, we're going to the Super Bowl, all this other stuff, then I think that the team would indeed, in that case, talk themselves into Derek Carr being the better option. And I don't think you have to do much to talk yourself into that, if I'm being honest. If you're an NFL team, I think the fan perspective is going to be different than the NFL team perspective, okay? Everyone believed that nobody wanted the New Orleans Saints job, and now here they are with, Kellen Moore as their head coach, stuff like that. So, the perspectives are going to be different inside the league than they are outside the league. And this happens with media and everybody as well. I'm guilty of it. We're all guilty of it. The way that the NFL would look at this equation is very simple. Veteran quarterback, more experience, 10 plus years in the league, gives you the better chance to win than the young unproven. That's typically the way that the NFL works. Now, I think you can point to several instances in which that is wrong, right? Many of you right now are saying, well, what about Patrick Mahomes, right? Patrick Mahomes is the perfect example. I understand Patrick Mahomes is the best quarterback in the NFL. I get that. So it's a little bit unfair to use him as an example, but let's just think about it this way. Imagine how good Patrick Mahomes is, and imagine the Kansas City Chiefs waiting even longer to turn things over to him. Because why? Veteran quarterback, extra experience, gives you the better chance to win. So I'm just saying that the logic behind it makes sense and is sound from a larger pool of examples, right? You can find more examples in which, across the NFL, in which the veteran quarterback with experience is the better option than the young guys that are on the roster. But you sure can find a lot of examples in which that's not the case either. Remember when Jalen Hurts was drafted, he was kind of drafted to play not really a Taysom Hill role, but he was drafted to play a little bit of a change of pace role and everything. And then eventually the Eagles were like, wait a minute, this guy could take us somewhere. And now they've won a Super Bowl with Jalen Hurts at the helm. So the argument in favor of keeping Derek Carr is about competing in 2025. But here's the caveat to that too. I'm supposed to be making the argument for, but it's so hard to make the argument for without giving up, without giving up a little bit of ground, right? And so I'm not going to give up the ground because again, I think the smarter decision is to move on. It's time for a split. It's okay. It's not about Derek Carr being a bad quarterback. It's not an evaluation of Derek Carr. It's just the situation. So here's why I stopped when I said, if you want to compete in 2025, that's fine. Well, here's the thing. You compete in 2025 with the hopes of getting into the quarterback conversation in 2026. But does competing in 2025 set you up to miss out on the quarterback conversation in 2026? I'm not talking about tanking because I don't think NFL teams tank. I don't think NFL players tank. Well, let me not say I don't think NFL teams tank. I think we've seen it, but I don't think players like to tank. And so I'm never going to put that out there. I'm just not, because of my respect for the players that have worked so hard to get to that point. To say that they're just going to go out there and lose games, no, I'm not about that. I respect those guys a lot. And so, but the other piece of it is you have to be sort of aware of where you are and where you're trying to get. It doesn't mean that you have to be bad in order to get into the quarterback conversation, but does Derek Carr, as your starter in 2025, end up removing you too far from that conversation to where you're having to trade up and go and get that quarterback and mortgage your future and, use some of that capital that you have while you're also trying to get your team younger, more dynamic, more playmakers and all those other things? Do you have those assets to really forfeit at that point in 2026? I don't know. I don't know that you're going to be in that position if you're the New Orleans Saints. I guess that depends on how this draft goes, how free agency this year, next year goes, all those other things as they're looking at adding talent before they even get to that point. But looking at it from here and in this perspective, it's tough to make the argument that trying to compete in 2025 and trying to set yourself up to make a playoff run and win your division and everything like that is actually the better thing to do. It's weird to say. Because it puts you out of range in that quarterback conversation. And it also leads you to find success with a quarterback that's probably not going to be around for you in the future. I don't know. It's a thing. But look, NFL teams play because NFL teams want to win. So building towards a competitive future, building towards a competitive present is something that you're going to see NFL teams do, and the New Orleans Saints have continuously done that. Post Drew Brees, during Drew Brees, before Drew Brees, this has been a team that has been built on the idea of trying to compete. They went to the market to hire a head coach, and they brought in his quarterback in Sean Payton and Drew Brees because they wanted to compete. They continued to, tinker with these contracts, restructure, kick cans down the road, all this other stuff because they wanted to remain competitive while Drew Brees was in the building. Then they went the continuity route after Sean Payton left. They continued to mortgage their future and kick the can down the road even before Sean Payton left, after Drew Brees left, because they wanted to compete. Then they went the continuity route after Sean Payton leaves because they wanted to compete. Then they signed Derek Carr because they wanted to compete and all these other things, right? So is it surprising to anybody, or would it be surprising to anyone at all if in 2025 this New Orleans Saints team came out and not just said that they wanted to compete, but went in and said, you know what? We're going to do all of the actions that show that we want to compete as well? I don't think that would shock anybody. But I also don't think that moving on from Derek Carr means moving on from the idea of competing. Because if you hit on this young quarterback, all of a sudden, you're in a much better situation, right? Like, you're exactly where you want to be. A young starting quarterback on a rookie deal, getting out of all the salary cap stuff and everything. You've got time, you've got the years, you'll be able to have the money, you can build around, you get started this year in this year's draft class and all these other things. And so even in the argument that is to keep Derek Carr, you can find the arguments to move on from Derek Carr in this situation. And again, I'm not even making the assessment based on my feelings around Derek Carr. I'm literally just looking at the situation. This isn't, like I said, this isn't about Derek Carr anymore. This is about Kellen Moore. And what we're going to get to next is why Kellen Moore doesn't owe anybody here anything at all, except for the people that hired him and the fans that will be purchasing the tickets. We got that coming up next as we continue on with today's episode of Locked On Saints, part of Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. Today's episode of Locked On Saints is brought to you by friends over at Prize Picks, the easiest and most fun way to play daily fantasy sports. No more having to rebuild your roster because of injuries. No more having to deal with bad trade requests and all this other stuff in your redraft leagues. No, none of that. And also, no playing up against a bunch of lineups that you just kind of have to believe were better than yours because of the lack of transparency. It's what I love about Prize Picks. It's you versus the house, you turning your football knowledge and football opinions into real, cold, hard cash. Here's what they do. They give you projections for players like Jason Tatum, 29 points. You take 2 to 6 of those players, choose more or less, get those right. You win up to 1,000 times your money back. And you could even check out their different promos like Taco Tuesday, which gives you some discounted player projections for even more value. Download the app today and use the promo code LOCKEDONNFL. You'll get $50 instantly after you play your first $5 lineup. That's promo code LOCKEDONNFL for $50 instantly when you play your first $5 lineup over at Prize Picks. Run your game. Let's get it, Who Dat Nation. The New Orleans Saints' new head coach, Kellen Moore, doesn't owe anyone anything on this roster, on this coaching staff, in this organization. He owes no loyalties at all. And that is something that a lot of people are going to have to be ready for. I'm not saying that Kellen Moore is going to walk into the New Orleans Saints facility, which, by the way, he'll be introduced via press conference on Thursday in the early afternoon tomorrow. And so I'm not saying that he's going to walk into that press conference after going up and down the hallways, being like, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired. You can stick around. No, I'm just playing. You're fired too. Like, I'm not saying he's going to do that. But what I'm saying is the loyalties right now have completely changed. We've seen a lot of, hey, we really like this player because they've been around for a long time. They've been a part of our organization for a long time. They've been a part of this system. They've been a part of this culture, all that. That's not going to be afforded anymore. This comes with what we discussed in yesterday's episode, the change in the regime, right? Kellen Moore comes in and he represents an entirely different future that is severed from the ties of the past. There's no Sean Payton connections anymore outside of Phil Galliano. There's no more of the kind of holdover pieces and things like that. Like, there's some folks that are still around, offensive assistants, defensive assistants, some special team stuff and everything like that. But there's no coordinators, there's no position coaches that were Payton hires anymore. Michael Hodges off to Cincinnati. And everybody else, like, he was kind of the last remaining one in terms of the position coaches that was actually hired by Sean Payton or was a part of Sean Payton's staff. Now, you have guys that are still holdovers as Dennis Allen's staff, so you might still consider them holdovers when it comes to Sean Payton because Dennis Allen was a holdover of Sean Payton. You've still got guys like Marcus Robertson. You've still got guys like Keith Williams at wide receivers coach, Clancy Brown at tight ends coach. Honestly, I'd consider keeping all three of those. But those guys and Kellen Moore don't really have the loyalties that Dennis Allen and maybe even Darren Rizzi to an extent, although I thought Darren Rizzi did a really good job when he took over as interim head coach, kind of showing like, hey, I ain't got loyalties to none of y'all, like moving, effectively demoting Todd Grantham, all these other things. But there's no more of this like sentimental value that's going to be afforded. And I don't think Kellen Moore is like, a cold, hard, cutthroat type of a guy, but that doesn't mean that he won't make tough decisions. You can have empathy and still move on from people. You can have empathy and still make tough decisions. And so I look at Kellen Moore coming in, not just representative as a severing of what was the past, the Payton past. And also, he's not just that, he's also representative of a new future. And being representative of a new future sometimes means to continue to sever yourself from the past. And so there's some big decisions that New Orleans has to make. We just highlighted the Derek Carr decision. We're going to do another episode taking a look at Spencer Rattler, what his future could look like with the team. But also, you're going to have some tough decisions around defensive veterans like Cam Jordan and Demario Davis, Tyrann Mathieu. Demario Davis, Tyrann Mathieu have already said, Demario Davis said he wanted to play 3 more years to Matt Moscona when he was talking with him over on After Further Review. I think he's the most likely one to stick around because he's still playing at a really high level. Tyrann Mathieu, though, dealt with some injuries last year, things like that. Like, it's going to have people kind of looking at him a little bit different. He told Brooke Kirchhoffer and her exclusive one-on-one with him, which you can find over on her YouTube channel, that he wanted to play for 2 more years. As well, he's only got 1 more year left on his deal here in New Orleans. What decisions are made in that situation? Like, if, let's say, Kellen Moore hires Brandon Staley as a defensive coordinator and Brandon Staley walks in and is like, I want to redo all of this. Kellen Moore is going to do that because Kellen Moore's loyalty now is to Brandon Staley, not to Tyrann Mathieu, not to Demario Davis, not to Cam Jordan, not to some of the other young guys too. I don't mean to just single out the veterans, but those are the guys that are getting paid. Right? Those are the guys with the cap numbers and all this other stuff. So that's where the attention is going to focus. It's unfair to them, but it's the way that this works. And so, and Cam Jordan has been very, very clear that he wants to remain in New Orleans. He wants to finish his career in New Orleans, all those other things. Is he going to be able to do so at his price tag? I don't think so. So something's got to give in terms of what that conversation is. But Kellen Moore, Brandon Staley, if he is indeed the defensive coordinator hire, whomever it might be, they're not going to have the loyalties to these guys that the rest of the organization is accustomed to having. And so the only loyalties that will impact those types of decisions, like we mentioned, are the guys that Kellen Moore hired, but also you. They want to win football games again. Will that happen in 2025? Probably not. Like, I would buckle in here a little bit. If I'm, I would highly recommend Saints fans buckle in for what could be a bumpy 2025, right? Just a little bit of turbulence. Ain't no thing, nothing to be worried about, ain't nothing to be scared of. Like, we're going to make it to the destination. It's going to be all right, but it's going to be bumpy on the way. And that's what I would expect. And then if that doesn't happen, then great. Awesome. Yippee. Like, that's great. That could be cool. That could be a lot of fun if things turn around immediately in 2025. But if they're going to turn around immediately in 2025, some of these tough decisions have to be made. What about the decision with Taysom Hill? How ready is he really going to be after an ACL surgery that takes 9 to 12 months to recover, assuming that there was an additional damage that also needed to be replaced, additional tendons, additional structure damage, whatever it might be? 9 months coming off of a December surgery, is he really going to be ready for the season? 10 months, 11 months, 12 months if it takes that long? $18 million cap hit, not really, 17.989, but basically an $18 million cap hit with $10 million base salary that's entirely non-guaranteed? That's a tough decision to make, but those are the types of decisions that New Orleans now has to make, and they're going to make those decisions now without the loyalties. They're going to make the decisions now because the culture that those guys were a part of is no longer the culture of the New Orleans Saints future. Now, they could have a place in the culture of the New Orleans Saints future 100%, but we don't know that right now. We have no idea because that's what Kellen Moore represents. Kellen Moore represents a change for the New Orleans Saints. He represents, in any head coach, I would say this about just about any head coach that they hired, as long as that coach didn't have ties to the previous regime, right? And so that is now the new question. What changes are being made that will lead to the opportunities to improve at a later time? Build everything. And so we'll see. We'll see. But I would not expect Kellen Moore and his new staff to have the same loyalties and sentimentality, I think is the word that I'm looking for, as the previous situation and the previous environment. And honestly, sometimes you do things that are the hard things to do because they're the better choices. And that might be what we see from the New Orleans Saints in the coming, let's call it, months. We're 1 month away exactly from the new league year beginning. So big days on the way for the New Orleans Saints. Coming up in tomorrow's episode, we discuss the future of Derek Carr, but I want to dive into a little bit further what I mentioned about this being potentially the last head coach hire for Mickey Loomis, because there's a world in which that is Mickey Loomis's best case scenario. We'll dive into that in tomorrow's episode. And of course, Kellen Moore's presser. So we'll have that later on in the week as well. We appreciate you very much, as always, for making us a part of your day, part of your routine, for saying yes to me in the show. If you see me, please say hi. And if you need anything else or on your New Orleans Saints in between these episodes, make sure you follow me on your favorite social media at Ross Jackson, NOLA. Hit me up. Let me know how the family's doing, let me know how you living. Let me know how you momming them. And trust you, that nation, I'll holla at you.